Welcome to Canada's podcast.
Hi, this is Celine Williams, hosting from Ontario for Canada's podcast. My guest today is Josh Teitel, the CEO and founder of the Canadian sustainable children's toy brand, Cate and Levi, and that's Cate with a C. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. I'm excited. I don't often get to talk to people who work with and play with toys all the time, so I'm excited about this. But before we jump into that, I'm curious how about your journey to get to running, creating, founding a toy brand, let alone a sustainable toy brand. How did that come about?
Yeah, for sure. The truth is, I've always been drawn to being an entrepreneur. I have always had a creative inkling. Actually, growing up, my mom was always very creative and had different crafts going, whether it was knitting or needlepoint, or she went through like a calligraphy phase. And my dad was always a small business owner. He used to import textiles from the Far East for women's clothing manufacturers in Canada. So that was sort of my experience growing up. And I always sort of felt like I was sort of a mixture of the two. So my mom's creativity and my dad's business acumen. And I really never applied it until when I finished college. I actually went traveling to Australia and New Zealand, and I found this really cool leather backgammon set. This predates Cate and Levi, and I sort of lugged it around with me, and I brought it home, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do next or what I was going to do for my career, but I showed it to a friend of mine who was also had the entrepreneurial bug, and without pausing, he just said, "All right, let's make it and sell it." So we with this one sort of travel backgammon set, we started manufacturing and ultimately turned that into a successful small business. And fast forward 7 or 8 years, and we sold it. Took some time off. I took some time off, and then teamed up with a designer who was making children's products. So she was actually making products out of recycled wool sweaters. However, I did sort of jump over another interesting part of my journey, which was while I was starting my first business, I also, for whatever reason, wrote the LSAT and applied to law school, and didn't really have much of a plan other than I had really supportive parents who always encouraged more and more education. So I applied to law school when I started my first business, and I got in. And I remember talking to my parents about it and saying, I'm starting this business, but I also just got into law school. What should I do? And in their mind, there was no question, like, you get in, you're going. So I didn't give it too much thought. I just went. And luckily I had a business partner who was not going to law school and was able to work on the day-to-day of the business. But I stayed involved throughout that time and was able to do both. So pretty interesting journey.
So that is fascinating. So I have a few questions, but I want to ask about, I'm going to assume that you are not currently practicing law as well as.
I am not currently practicing law. So basically I did 3 years of law school at University of Windsor. And then I did my 1 year of articling at a business law firm in downtown Toronto. But it was funny because my manufacturing was also downtown, but west of the financial district, more in the garment district. So there were days when I was articling where I would need to go over to my manufacturing facility. So I would literally, take my suit jacket off, leave it on the back of my chair, leave a hot cup of coffee on my desk, and sort of run over to Bathurst and Adelaide to do something in relation to my own company, and then run back to the law firm to resume my duties there. So that went on for the 10 or 11 months that I was articling. But then by the time I finished articling, my first company was at a sustainable enough size that I made the decision to leave law and pursue that full time.
Got it. So so it's really interesting when when someone studies something, has a degree in something like law, that most, I think there's a general perception that if you study law, if you study medicine, if you study certain things, then that's your passion and you're going to pursue that for the rest of time. And that's the thing that you do. And I think it's really interesting when people study something like that and make a very specific choice to not pursue that. And I imagine it's come in handy because all of the things that we learn come in handy at a certain point in time. But, having the ups and downs and the realities of being an entrepreneur, because they are real, and I imagine that you have experienced them as well. What's kept you in the entrepreneur world? What's been the inspiration to keep doing that instead of going, you know what? I have a law degree. I could go figure out being a lawyer if I want to at some point.
Yeah, listen, it's an interesting question. And there's certainly been times throughout, I've now run two businesses, built and operated two companies. And there's definitely been nights in both businesses where I'm sort of lying awake, thinking about what it is that I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And did I choose the more difficult path? Why don't I just have a normal job and career like I could with the degree that I have? But I guess at the end of the day, it's like, I don't know that I chose to be an entrepreneur. I think it's just who I am. And even at the low points where things aren't necessarily going my way, for whatever reason, I have enough staying power to sort of wait it out for the next wave to catch. So yeah, I mean, I think at this point, I'm probably past the point of going back, although I don't know, it was only a few years ago that I was thinking like, okay, maybe it's time to do something a little bit more mainstream. I mean, there's definitely aspects. I don't know if I were to go back to law, and it's not really in my mind anymore, but if I were to go back to, now that I'm thinking about it, like, I don't know that I would be drawn to even business law. Like part of law that I was always most intrigued about was criminal. So would I try to stage a third career and go back and be defense counsel? I don't know. I mean, I would never say never, but I'm not there right now.
Yeah, that's fair. You mentioned some of those nights when at the low points. I'm curious, what have been some of the hardest moments of being an entrepreneur, and what have been some of the best moments for you?
For sure. I mean, listen, when I was younger and building my first business called Tygo Enterprises with a good buddy of mine, like that's sort of a period of time where it's like, you don't even, looking back, it's like, I couldn't even appreciate how amazing it was at the time just because I hadn't been through it before. But like being a young person with not a lot of responsibility and the ability to really take risk with not a lot of, with not a lot of downside, like that's a really special time. In terms of low point, like that would, that's probably as good as it gets. Having said that, though, it's like I then sold it, had some time off, and got to do it again, knowing now what I didn't know then. So it's like also like a really interesting period to sort of go back and do it again, but it's with a different energy level and maybe a little bit more cynicism than when you're younger and you don't realize how difficult it is. But I would say like, starting again after selling the first business was really hard. But I would say the low points, the low points always come back to, for me, it always comes back to sales. And I would say, like, in the last 5 years, the really hard part was when the pandemic hit. We were mostly, for Cate and Levi, we were mostly a wholesale model. So we were selling to brick and mortar stores. And within weeks, everyone shut their doors. And the business was essentially like, my current business partner and I, we were having these discussions like, how much longer? Like, we can't keep paying the overhead if everyone's closed. And that's sort of where the next opportunity emerged. So it's like, okay, well, brick and mortar isn't working. What is? Oh yeah, we set up this Amazon account a few years ago that we haven't really focused on. This is probably the time to dig in a little there. And sure enough, it's like Amazon exploded. We were there already. Luckily, not strategically, but we had already built out our shop and started pushing it during the at the beginning of the pandemic. And sure enough, like, Amazon kept the lights on and has now become the biggest part of our business. So it's interesting, right? It was like a really dark period, but our new and best channel emerged from that. So yeah, like, really, really lucky and, really, interesting time.
So I've spoken to a few entrepreneurs in the past couple of years who had some sort of, whether it was an in-person business like events or something, or were dealing with brick and mortar, whether they were brick and mortar or they were making something that was sold through brick and mortar. And all of that changed dramatically. I mean, they either, ended that business and started something new, or they had to change their model in some way. And I want to acknowledge, I think it's incredible that you had that Amazon storefront already built out, even though you weren't using it, that you had done that.
Lucky.
Yeah. But it's kind of cliche to say this, but what were some of the lessons that you learned in that change that stand out for you, that you think this was important to note, or it would be helpful for someone else at some point to be aware of or think about these things?
Yeah, listen, I think as an entrepreneur, you just have to be open to being uncomfortable and to pivoting. And I think that's, if you're not able to sort of live through the uncomfortable periods, then you should choose a different career. But if you're open to being uncomfortable and to, just sort of going with, just sort of watching the waves and waiting for the next one, usually there's another opportunity, but you have to be open to it. So, we could have just shut the business at the beginning of COVID and been done with it, and then had, gone on to have more stable and normal careers, but we didn't. And, luckily we didn't, because it worked out again, but we were uncomfortable for a while, and you have to be open to that.
I think humans in general, not just entrepreneurs. I think entrepreneurs often less so than other folks in more traditional roles. We want to minimize discomfort in any way, shape, or form. Whether we're avoiding it or not, we want to minimize it. So those uncomfortable moments come, and it immediately becomes, how do we get comfortable again, as opposed to what you're talking about, which is stay in the discomfort. I'm not saying long term, but enough to figure out what the wave is, or to figure out what's coming, or to try something new that we might not, that in and of itself is another layer of discomfort.
For sure. Yeah, all the all of the above.
So so in some of the waves that have come in both of your businesses and Cate and Levi, especially with the pandemic, how I think that one of the things that I hear from entrepreneurs a lot is how do, how do you know? Like, how long do you wait it out? What's the, you know, do we wait out until we have no money left and then declare bankrupt? Like, how do you know? And I'm curious from your experience, how did you know? What were you looking for? What are signs that you were paying attention to? What are some of the things that you were looking at or keeping top of mind in the discomfort between the waves?
Listen, everyone has their own risk tolerance.
For sure.
So I knew that if we couldn't figure out a way quickly to cash flow the business, I my risk tolerance sort of my risk tolerance was capped there. So like this business at the very least has to cash flow itself. I'm not going to, because we were many years into it. So I wasn't prepared to go into my pocket and fund it. It had to cash flow. So that was the first hurdle. And luckily, very quickly with Amazon at the time, we were able to do that. So that's like, so once we were able to plug the leak, then it's a question of, okay, can we make it viable again? Can it be more than a break even? So I think it just depends on the person's risk tolerance. Like sometimes, I'll watch Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, and the entrepreneur will say like, I took a second mortgage on my house. I used my kids' college fund, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh my God, like good for you. But I'm not that. My risk tolerance is lower than yours.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not prepared to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So which might explain why neither of my businesses have become massive. They're more lifestyle businesses. They pay me. They pay my business partner. They cash flow positive, but they're not behemoths. So I think a lot of it just comes down to the risk profile of the owners. So I sort of know where my red line is.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
It does. Is it appealing to you at all to have or create a behemoth type business that is?
listen, I think when you're younger, those are the stories that you read about the most. So we're always reading about like, oh, the guy who started Shopify and built $100 billion, blah, 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 like whatever it is. Like it's always, I feel like the media is always focused on the 1 in a billion huge stories, but there's so many small businesses out there that are basically the backbone of Canada. They have, they pay a living wage. The owners do well. And I think those are the stories that we don't necessarily focus on enough. So like, no, the truth is water finds its level, and this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So do I wish I had something much bigger? I don't know. It's sort of it's a crazy way to live and to think about things. It's like at the end of the day, we all just do our best. And this is what I'm meant to be doing.
Yeah. I appreciate that answer because I think you're right. We hear so often, and I hear it when, when I talk to startup founders, especially where they're looking for funding to get them to this level to do this next thing. And I mean, if you're 25 years old and you don't have a family and that's what you want to spend all your time doing, great. Like focus on that for the time being. And there are a lot of other ways to be successful
Yeah, and I think I totally agree, and I don't think those stories are told enough. Like we're always
Agreed.
glorifying the so and so did a round C $100 million blah blah blah, and it's like who cares? Like that's his path. Good luck, wish him well, but that's not necessarily your path. Like I started my first business. Literally, my business partner and I, we each put in $2,500 that we had saved up as like young people from birthday gifts or something.
Yeah.
And we literally never put in another dollar and built it up to millions of dollars in sales and then had a successful exit. Literally started with $5,000 and just sort of figured it out as we went along. Like, and you can still do that. It's not the stories that we hear about every day. It's always about so-and-so raised and acquired customers and they were taken over by blah, blah, blah. Like it's just, I don't know when that story like that. I don't know when that storyline took over, but I don't think it has to be that way. And that it doesn't have to be that way. And that was just never my calling and still isn't.
Yeah. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think knowing that is really important because to your point, those are often the stories we tell is growth in terms of, millions of dollars of sales per year, not necessarily profitability, growth in terms of the number of people you hire in a business, which is an insane metric to have as a metric of success. And then, and in terms of investment, and it's like, there are people who, do well, run successful businesses by their own metrics, who are not wanting for whatever they need in life. They travel, they live, whatever. And they're working 20 hours a week because they've designed a business that allows them to do that. And they're not going to be $100 million businesses. And they don't want that because that is not going to be 20 hours a week.
Yeah, I agree.
And I appreciate not that I'm saying you only work 20 hours a week. I'm not, but I appreciate your story because it's not that of I need to grow to this specific behemoth size and take over the world with toys.
Yeah. No, it's just our own story. And it just comes down to what we're comfortable doing.
So I have this is kind of a pivot in the conversation. I do have a question specifically about the sustainability aspect of the business you run, because sustainability is a huge topic in general when it comes to entrepreneurship. And there are a lot of, I know a lot of our listeners are very passionate about sustainable businesses for themselves, whether they're creating it or investing in them or, doing business with them, buying from them, whatever the case may be. And I'm curious, because I haven't heard a lot about toys that are sustainable, how, what that is for Cate and Levi, why it's important, what that looks like, in general. I know it's a vague question, but I don't want to make assumptions about beyond the original. They were made with sweaters, right? Beyond that, I don't want to make assumptions about what it looks like now.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a very, very much part of our brand story. So, originally when I started Cate and Levi, I had teamed up with this designer that was making not children's stuff, but like homewares out of recycled sweaters. And at the time, my wife and I were about to welcome our first son, Levi, into the world. And I noticed, like, as I was starting to, I've always been drawn to like the product world. So I was starting to investigate different products I would want for my own son and realized that there wasn't really a lot out there that was responsibly made and eco-friendly. That was interesting. Like everything was very granola, vanilla looking. So at the same time, by sort of putting myself out there, I met this designer and asked her if she could make a few stuffed animals that I would pay her for my son using the same manufacturing process. And sure enough, they turned out great and, showed them around and had a great response. And it just sort of grew from there. today, when we come out with a new item or a new direction, like we also make items out of polar fleece right now, which has a percentage of recycled plastic in it. So it's like we're always looking at new projects through the same lens. So yeah, it's definitely it's important to us, but we also realize like that's part of why we're not going to be the next, Spin Master, because we don't make products for everybody. The truth is, a lot of people don't care about the environment, and they just want the cheapest, lowest concept, that after 2 months, when little Timmy's done with it, they'll just throw it away. So, which is fine. Like that's just a different part of the market. We're not in that market. We're trying to build products that, that you'll keep for your, that you'll put it once the child is done playing with it, it becomes a bit of an heirloom and you'll put it away for the next generation. Does that happen every time? No. Lots of people still don't care. However, that's sort of the philosophy, which is basically buy less, but buy better. So our products, like our hand puppets can be $30, whereas, a company like Melissa and Doug will sell 5 generic ones that they make offshore, and they'll sell them for 5 for half the price. And it's not that they're just different. It's like, it's a different customer profile. Some people prefer to buy less and buy better. And that's the customer that we're going after, which ultimately just means we're going to be smaller.
Yeah. And I think that it's an important note that there are, we talk about knowing your customer, knowing that niching, et cetera, et cetera. And there is absolutely a market there always has been, there always will be, for something that is not cheaply made, not meant to be discarded, but is consciously created in an intentional way. And I think that's a really important reminder for folks. Before we wrap this up, I want to ask one last question, which is, if you could go back in time and give yourself, when you were a fresh-faced entrepreneur, one piece of advice, what advice would you give yourself?
Good question. I think you just have to, like, I had an open mind, but I would like to go back. If I could go back in time and do it again, I would have an even more open mind to opportunities and possibilities. And, anytime there was like the smallest door opening, I should investigate. Like we did well, like we were successful. But when I look back, it's like, I remember, we were once speaking to a big buyer about one of our products, and she wanted us to make modifications and try to like customize it a little bit for them. And I didn't pursue it wholeheartedly. Whereas I think, like, if I can go back in time, I should just I should really just turn over every single stone, and not leave anything unturned. And I think that's like, really just have as open a mind and be as wide-eyed as possible, which we were, but you could always be more. So I think it just sort of comes down to attitude.
I love that. And I think it's great advice. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate your time, Josh.
Yeah.
For those listening, this will be in the show notes, but you can learn more about Josh and Cate and Levi at cateandlevi.com. And that's cateandlevi.com. And thanks for listening to Canada's podcast. Like, comment, and subscribe to all our channels to get the latest podcasts from entrepreneurs across Canada.